Good afternoon. I'm Yusuf Mahmoud, Senior Advisor IPI. Welcome. Today's forum, hosted in partnership with the Dag Hammarskjöld Foundation, is an opportunity to learn about and discuss the report of the advisory group of experts for the 2015 review of the UN Peacebuilding Architecture. The report, titled The Challenge of Sustaining Peace, was recently submitted to the presidents of the GA and the Security Council and was formally launched earlier today across the street at the UN. This afternoon, we are joined by the chair of the advisory group of experts, Ambassador Gert Rosenthal, and two of its members, Saraswati Menon and Anis Bajwa. We're also joined by Oscar Fernandez Taranco, Assistant Secretary General for Peace Building Support, to discuss the report's analysis and recommendations, and to see to what extent these can help the United Nations improve its performance in peace building. To begin our conversation, I will ask our panel 2 rounds of questions. The first round will explore the recommendations from the report. The second round will look ahead to implementation and synergies with this year's other review processes. And my first question goes to Gert, the chairperson of this advisory group. And my question to him, which of the report's recommendations, if implemented, you believe could enhance the role of the UN peacebuilding architecture in sustaining peace? You have the floor, Gert.
Well, thank you, Yusuf. I'm happy to be here for the second time in less than a week. So my collection of pens is increasing. About 2 hours ago, I was with a group of ex-colleagues over on the other side of the street. And I mentioned that the main thrust of our report is not so much examining the 3 entities that were created in 2005, although that's very much present, but it's more a systemic look at a rather fragmented organization which deals with peace and security with one principal organ and development with at least one, probably 2 principal organs. So the direct question, what is the UN doing wrong, or why aren't the entities created in 2005 raising to their expectations? The question is really, the answer is really a systemic one. The different parts of the organization are not working well together, which in the first place has an extremely high opportunity cost, and in the second place doesn't need to be that way, because we believe that with a little more political faith put in greater coherence, the Peacebuilding Commission could play a really important role. Because as you know, it's an advisory body. It's not a principal organ. Its role is to advise the 3 principal organs. And that gives it a golden opportunity to act as a bridge between General Assembly, ECOSOC, and Security Council, and also a bridge between the 3 conventional pillars that we talk about as a great purposes of the United Nations, which are maintaining international peace and security, defending and promoting human rights, and promoting development, bringing them together. None of the principal organs can do this on its own. So the whole thrust of our report is to overcome the fragmentation and introduce a little more coherence into the work of the House.
Thank you very much. Anis, on to you. How can we build, let alone sustain peace in situations where the state is fragile and governance is weak? Based on your study, what are the peace-building options for the UN in today's challenging environment?
Thank you. Yeah, okay. Thank you, Yusuf. I like it when you say in today's challenging environments, because that is something on which we have dwelled quite in some detail in our report also, as to how the international milieu is changing with regard to peace and security, and how new challenges are emerging to peace globally, and new forms of violence are coming into existence, while the old forms of violence and old forms of conflict have not yet really abated, and there are new forms of conflict, new forms of violence, which are actually morphing the environment. But anyhow, I'll not go there. I'll sort of like to talk to the question that you asked me more directly. Yes, you're right. In fact, just ensuring that the guns go silent is not enough for building peace. In our sort of thinking, as we've deliberated, we think that peace building is something that is not, in fact, related to just silencing of guns. It runs through the whole cycle of peace and conflict, and it should not be associated only with post-conflict situations. So prevention of conflict actually is very much part, and should be very much part, of peace building. And that's why we have preferred to call it sustaining peace in our report, rather than just building peace. In situations, where the state is fragile and governance is weak, and that is really the situation more often than not in states which have just come out of conflict, and where peace is a fresh phenomenon after a conflict. I think one of the most important things that needs to be looked at is how do you include all the interests that may be in the political arena and the social arena, and into this dialogue and into this process, because associating ownership of the peace building process, which essentially has to be a national process, with the elites and with the government and with the sort of protagonists or antagonists or ex-antagonists only, is fraught with the possibility of conflict recurring. And therefore, there has to be a wider and a broader and more inclusive ownership that must be sought, with all the various strata of society, including communities, and particularly with a focus on women and youth. How can they be incorporated in that dialogue? The other thing is that, states which undergo conflict are not sort of blank slates that you overwrite a sort of a new concept on those. There are always in those states originally existing systems of patronage, of brokering, traditional mediation systems and forms which cannot be forgotten, which must be brought into the process of building peace, what we once again, to reiterate, try to and like to call sustaining peace. And then perhaps sometimes, we want to bring in all the best practices into situations with every good intention, into situations which are post-conflict. But we must always be conscious that one size does not fit all. I mean, it's an oft-repeated phrase, but I'm repeating it again. So we must tailor our responses to the situation as it is specific to that state and to that country and to those people. And then I would say that we should also take advantage of South-to-South linkages and organizations like G7 Plus, which is an organization of the fragile states themselves, and UN needs to engage more positively and more actively with such organizations to seek help. Thank you, Mehmet.
Thank you very much. Saraswati, I always hesitate to ask this question because it deals with women, that it should be always addressed by a woman, as if women, peace and security is a women-only issue. But that's my script, so I'm going to ask you the question. What recommendation does the report make on enhancing women's participation in peace building?
Thank you for asking the question, even though to me. Gender equality features very strongly in our report, and we are very, very happy that it also features very strongly in the other reports that are being submitted. And I would like to thank you, because you are a member of both the other panels, and I know you contributed to that. So the Peace Operations Report contains a strong thread of gender, and certainly the 1325 review will address this. We look at three issues in looking at gender equality and women's empowerment concerns, women's rights concerns. The first set have to do with the impact of conflict on women. And in our report, we've analyzed what conflicts look like today, what is persisting, what has changed. And unfortunately, one of the elements that is persisting is the continued violence against women, and often the impunity that goes with it, despite many efforts by the international community to address this. But we also see something new. If you look across the whole range of extremist forces in conflict, one factor that they have in common is that all of them attack women's rights. And this is a concern, because this is an overlay over an impact that has existed for a long time. And so this is something that has to be dealt with up front. The second set of issues has to do with the role of women in contributing to transformation. Women as agents of change, as agents of peacemaking and peace building. This is something that was recognized 15 years ago by the Security Council Resolution 1325 and successive resolutions. But we really do not see changes in a material sense, despite these commitments. In our work, when we visited our 5 case studies, this is something we saw demonstrated on the ground. Women's organizations across the board had contributed to building peace, to preventing conflict, and they were recognized to an extent nationally, but there isn't a clear attention or drawing their capacities into what the international community is doing to build peace. So this is something that we have emphasized also in our recommendations, and we really want to place before you. The third set of issues has to do with how peace building is actually carried out, and how it often fails to address the specific needs of women and girls. Let me just give you a few examples. When you look at security sector reform or rule of law, and we talk about this, there is some attention to violence against women during conflict. But studies have shown that the result of this is increased violence in public spaces and domestic violence even after the conflict ends. So any reform that takes place has to address these issues. Look at economic recovery, where a lot of attention is paid to creating jobs in the formal sector. And little attention is paid to the impact then that this has on unpaid care work that women do, and which has often been exacerbated because during a conflict, the distances to firewood, distances to water, etc., increase and become more and more insecure. So an attention to social services, which would reduce this burden of unpaid care work, is important in peace building. This is why we support very strongly something that is already on the table, that is attaining and surpassing the Secretary General's commitment for the UN system as a whole to reach 15%, which is a fairly low target for peace-building expenditures aimed at promoting women's empowerment. We also feel that PBF, which has already done quite a lot, can do more in this area to ensure that financing goes to these areas so that peace-building now really addresses the needs of women. And finally, I really want to underline that the Peace-Building Commission probably could do more in advocating gender equality, women's rights, and women's empowerment as part of national peace-building priorities to address all these three areas: the impact of conflict on women, the contribution that women themselves make, and the need to address the specific needs of women and girls. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Talking about financing is really a segue for the next question to Gert. The report, Gert, shows that predictable long-term funding is important for peace building. What recommendation does the report make on financing, including ways to enhance the peace building fund?
Well, first of all, as you know, the United Nations is not an international funding agency. But having said that, there are important elements in our report which have to do with the provision of long-term predictable financing for peace building or for maintaining sustainable peace. The first derives from the philosophical context of the report that we should do more in peace prevention instead of peace operations. It really is remarkable that we dedicate over $8 billion a year for peace operations, but we dedicate a small fraction of that for anything called peace building. So we would like to have a better balance. The second thing is, as you know, we do have the Peace Building Fund, which we view as a very important mechanism. We would like to strengthen it. We are recommending that a small provision in the UN's regular budget be allocated to the Peace Building Fund so that it has core resources which it can then leverage when it goes out looking for voluntary funding. We make much of the need for the UN to partner with international funding institutions, and especially the World Bank, which is still part of the UN system. And there's an interesting element. As you know, we've insisted for many, many years that the World Bank and the UN should work together. It's been very difficult because the systems of governance of the two institutions are so different. And then the World Bank, which depends from ministries of finance, and the UN, which depends from ministries of foreign affairs, often don't see eye to eye on many topics, and that filters down to their respective staffs. But there's one exception to that, and that is in the area of sustainable peace. Because the World Bank has a very small percentage of its portfolio in what they call fragile states or conflict-prone states. And there they need the UN to work together with the UN. So the basis of a productive partnership is present, based on the comparative advantages of the two organizations. And there's no reason to limit this to the World Bank. We have the regional development banks, we have the new emerging international financial institutions, the Asia Development and Infrastructure Bank, the BRIC Bank. So the point is the UN should partner with those institutions, especially for this type of countries. The third thing has to do with the regular budget of the UN. I was telling the group of delegates on the other side of the street this morning, we have a situation where on the drawdown of peace operations, the Security Council says, okay, we're going to transfer these duties to the country team. And then they instruct the country team to do many of the things that the departing peace operation was doing in the area of institution building, capacity building, rule of law, many topics. But they don't give it 1 cent of the regular budget to perform. So we found in our visits to some of the case studies that where there is a drawdown and where the country team is asked to continue on certain peace building activities, there's a virtual collapse of the presence of the UN for lack of funding. And finally, we're looking also at the question of domestic revenue generation, which is an important issue. It takes you into other areas which have been discussed many times, especially in the Security Council. The Kimberley process, the whole area of extractive industries, what countries, many of these countries have extractive industries. So there is a potential there to mobilize domestic resources for sustainable peace. We delve into those topics, so there is quite a bit on financing.
Thank you very much. Just the last question under this first round, and this is addressed to Oscar. When I was heading an integrated peacebuilding office in Burundi, I was one of the first beneficiaries of the Peacebuilding Fund, $85 million of them. And it did wonders to coherence and integration until the money ran out. How do you think the report's recommendations, as they are stated, be beneficial to further empower the PBF to drive greater coherence and integration of the UN action in the field?
Thank you, Mahmoud, and it is a pleasure and an honor to be here with the part of the authors of the Peacebuilding Architecture Review panel. Actually, I think, just relating to one of the entities of the peacebuilding architecture, I know we're trying to move beyond the word and usage of the word architecture, but I think if there's one performing element of the peacebuilding entities, it has been the Peacebuilding Fund. And I think one of the reasons this fund has been relevant and has actually been one of the most important sources of drivers of coherence, of strategic, focused intent, if you will, of bridging the silos between UN country teams and mission settings has been precisely the issue of funding. I think when the members of the panel, and if you read the report carefully and look at the many causes of the fragmentation that we have in the UN system, one of the key and fundamental drivers of fragmentations and the siloed approach is precisely the way that the different entities of the UN are funded. Agencies, funds and programs, secretariat, political missions, peacekeeping operations, each one has a very different channel and mechanism of operating. And so interestingly, and I think what comes out in this report and is acknowledged, is that the Peacebuilding Fund has actually been serving as a very important bridge of coherence, of integration, of actually driving a more coherent, a more strategic UN on the ground, and actually focusing on the very political aspects of peacebuilding, the type of money that usually is very difficult for any agency, fund, or program to get. And certainly many of the peacekeeping operations and special political missions are not provided precisely with this type of funding stream. So to your question, Mahmoud, I think it is extremely important because, one, the report acknowledges the scarcity of funding, that funding is a major problem. I think the report talks about the repeated fiscal cliffs, the before, during, and after a mission arrives in a country, how UN country teams struggle to actually be able to respond to that very important notion of conflict prevention. But in the middle of a conflict, also how to address some of the fundamentals of promoting inclusive, legitimate politics, how to work in security sector reform, rule of law, and how to address this issue of the peace dividend. So what's unique about the Peacebuilding Fund that I think is reinforced by this study is that it is very high risk tolerant. One of the reasons many of these conflict areas find it difficult to mobilize funding is that, for the most part, the existing funding mechanisms are very risk adverse. So the Peacebuilding Fund actually has been designed with this particular purpose to be the investor of first recourse, so to speak, to be able to launch a dynamic that can hopefully address and mitigate some of the risks of getting involved in some of these sectors and presumably incentivize the bigger organizations like the World Bank, the European Union, regional development banks to follow through. And this certainly has been the case in Burundi, was the case in the Central African Republic. It's the case today in Somalia, where we're actually using national systems to try to build the national capacities of entities. So just to state that I think it's a proven instrument. It's a very powerful incentive of UN coherence, and I hope that, and it's interesting that both the peace operations review and this review both are basically recommending the same thing, that this peacebuilding fund need predictability. That's, I think, something that's extremely important. It's very difficult to engage in sensitive political processes if the funding can't be assured up front to carry through and to be able to deliver. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Oscar. Now, looking ahead to implementation, I move now to the second round of questions and ask Gert, and perhaps later on Oscar can comment. And the question is, what type of a reform peacebuilding commission do you see emerging at the end of the review process, of which you were the first element or the first phase, Gert?
Well, I think it has to be taken in the context of the recommendations of the other two panels in two directions, because I mentioned the question of fragmentation, and I also mentioned the question of putting accent on conflict prevention vis-a-vis peace operations. So it has to be taken in that context. I think one could have marginal improvements in the working of the three entities that were created in 2005, even if nothing happened. But there we would really be passing up an opportunity. What we really need is for the, as I said before, for the Peace Building Commission to be able to fulfill the role of a bridge, which would bring together the peace, the human rights, and the development. What would the Peacebuilding Commission look like if our desires were met? In the first place, it would be far and away the most important entity in the so-called peace-building architecture. Because there's a lot of people in the UN who today say, well, the Peacebuilding Commission are really the 6 country-specific configurations. And the organizational committee is something there that's for ritual, for a yearly organizational meeting, but the real activity takes part. We don't see it that way. We think the potential of the Peacebuilding Commission has to be measured in terms of its capacity to bring together the 3 principal organs and in upgrading its capacity to do serious work on policies and strategies in peacebuilding. Those are 2 very important departures from where we are right now. There have been some experimentation with that, especially in the last year under Ambassador Patriota, where the Peacebuilding Commission did address some very important issues. And I think that moves us in the right direction. But we can go much further. Then there's a question of ownership of the Peacebuilding Commission. The original intention when Security Council, ECOSOC, and General Assembly were asked to propose 7 candidates each was for those principal organs to feel some sense of ownership. This is our forum. But it hasn't worked out that way. What's happened is that countries who want to be members go looking in which forum do they have the greatest probability of being elected. And as soon as they're elected, they forget of who elected them. So what we're saying, and by the way, the 2010 review also recommended this, is that the 7 members that were elected by Security Council report back to the Security Council and be kind of the link. The same goes for the General Assembly and ECOSOC, so that we can truly give it the meaning of the bridge. For me, that's the single most important thing. And finally, the agenda. I don't see any reason why we have to be limited to 6 countries that were recommended by the Security Council. I see a peacebuilding commission which addresses a range of situations, which can go anywhere from a country asking them to organize one meeting, either a donors conference or at least offer a venue where that country can explain its problem to the international community, to the types of things it's doing now. But we see a peacebuilding commission with a much more diversified agenda, both in terms of membership and in terms of topics to be covered. And we still see a role for country-specific configurations, but we see smaller country-specific configurations, more flexible. We talk about the precedent of the friends of that were used for mediation efforts, to have a similar figure and not make it contingent on being on the agenda of the Peacebuilding Commission. I can easily visualize countries being on the agenda who do not need nor want a specific country configuration. So I see a much more diversified group which will be able to fulfill also a little more diversified range of functions. And finally, I still think that if I had to identify one key role for the Peacebuilding Commission, it's advocacy. With the advocacy role, you can go a long ways towards meeting the original expectations of the 2005 resolution.
Thank you very much, Gert. Oscar, any comments? Obviously, you are in charge of one of the elements of this architecture that provide substantive and other support to the other 2. Any thoughts on this question?
Reiterate, I think the report actually does a very good job at analyzing what the Peacebuilding Commission has been able to accomplish, but as well what the limitations have been so far. And I think Gert was just referring at how difficult this bridging role actually is, not just with the Security Council, but with the General Assembly and ECOSOC. And I think that notion of the bridging role is something that needs to be, how can I say, better articulated in terms of what is the potential. And I think something that runs very strong throughout the report, and I think it's also, there's some elements of this in the peace operation, is that it is extremely important that through this unique membership, that the root causes of conflict actually be the result of a thorough analysis that involves the different parts of the UN thinking together, not just member states, but certainly inside the UN itself, and how to create that partnership between the policymakers, the UN agencies, funds, programs, the Secretariat, donors, international financial institutions, regional organizations, the voice of civil society, etc., to come together, analyzing and being able to provide a particular attention to the drivers of conflict. And in that sense, to be able to articulate better, if you will, the conflict prevention part that I think runs very strongly through this. The other, I think, important aspect, and certainly Ambassador Patriota, and it's the case with current chair, Ambassador Skog, how the Peacebuilding Commission is able to bridge that link with the regional organizations, with the changing nature of conflict, and where regional organizations and sub-regional organizations are increasingly playing an active role, how that is articulated. And certainly last year, the Peacebuilding Commission, I think, stepped up quite significantly the relationship with the African Union, and through that political relationship, also the substantive work that was going on in actually addressing illicit transfer of funds, the issue of national revenue generation, etc. I would add that maybe as well, when we talk about integrating the peace and security part of the House with the development and human rights, again, this speaks to the membership composition of the Peacebuilding Commission and how that is actually articulated to ensure that integrated responses that can eventually inform the discussions that circulate mandates in the Security Council are actually informed through this type of more open discussion among member states. And maybe last but not least, and I think certainly for the UN, this is always a very challenging moment, the issue of transitions. I think Gert was already referring to this. Ambassador Rosenthal was describing how whether it's a peacekeeping operation in particular, but also special political missions, at the end of the mandate is usually when we find this dramatic collapse, I would say, of the UN presence, the political presence, the type of presence that is required to continue to engage the political actors in a way that prevents the relapse or the lapse back into conflict. And so how the Council and the Peacebuilding Commission could work better together in timing these transitions and actually offloading, if you will, countries that are no longer a threat to international peace and security, but do still require the type of diplomatic, political attention that the Peacebuilding Commission can offer, is something that I think the report makes a very strong case and actually is substantiated by the case studies. If you see and you read the little boxes that are in the report, sustaining peace is about precisely preventing the relapse, and sustaining peace has everything to do about building the national institutions, building an inclusive society, addressing issues of reconciliation. So it's a long-term approach that only a structure like the Peacebuilding Commission can have the time to address the medium and long-term challenges ahead.
Thank you very much. Anis, as you've heard, partnership to sustain peace is an important component of the report. Based on your deliberation and the case studies and some of the recommendations that are contained in the report, how should the UN go about this business of partnership in the future in the search for sustainable peace?
Our report does. Thank you. Our report does lay particular emphasis on partnerships, and but I think the first partnership that ought to be built is actually internal to the UN itself, within the intergovernmental bodies and within the Secretariat, and between the peace and security and human rights and development pillars of the UN. So before going to partner with people outside the UN system, I think the more important partnership is internal. But having said that, and that has been, of course, emphasized already by Gert and by Oscar also, we think that it is important in our efforts to sustain peace to partner with organizations which are beyond the United Nations presence in the field and in headquarters, which are engaged in all sorts of activities with relation to bringing or helping countries come out of conflict and and enter into some sort of sustainable peace. And those partners, I think, can be categorized as two sets of partners that we need to engage with. One are those organizations, regional, sub-regional, which are political and security related, and the others are those which are financial and economic related organizations. Political and security related organizations are mostly regional and sub-regional, like African Union and ECOWAS and European Union for that matter, which is a very important, which is a regional organization but a very important global player in terms of peace and security and addressing violent situations and situations of crisis. And in that, I would want to emphasize that we should not be looking at these partnerships only in the context of engaging with them at a time when either a conflict has broken out or it is a case of post-conflict situation, etc., etc. No, I think one point of great focus in our report is about prevention of conflict. And when we talk of prevention, we are not only talking of prevention of recurrence of conflict, but prevention of conflict ab initio, if possible, and where possible. And that actually should take us to the need for not just greater political engagement with the situations where there is a potential for conflict occurring, but also looking at the UN's capacity for analysis of situations to determine as to where that political engagement must take place. And that political engagement will also require partnerships with political organizations in the various regions. That's one set of partners. But I do want to caution here that for every situation, we'll have to analyze case by case as to which partners or which regional organizations or which sub-regional organizations need to be engaged. And sometimes it may not actually be organizations, it may just be neighboring countries that you have to engage with and partner with. But the fear there sometimes is that there are at times vested interests of the neighbors and of the sub-regional organizations, etc., in a situation. So it has to be done carefully. The other set of partners that we need to focus on are, like I said, are the international financial institutions like the World Bank, but not just the World Bank, also IMF. And also regional financial institutions, particularly the ones like the BRICS Bank and the Asian Infrastructure Development Bank and banks like that, Asian Development Bank, etc. We've already spoken of the dire need for more funding for activities that we would categorize as peace building or sustaining peace. And therefore, there's an essential need to partner with these organizations. Another point I want to make is that somehow, we more often than not, when we are talking of peace and conflict and peace building and partnering, we tend to focus more and more on Africa. We should, I think, stop being Africa-centric with regard to efforts on peace building and security issues. There are a lot of other conflicts which occur in other places. Asia is full of them. I don't need to name countries and regions. But the important thing to note is that while Africa has organizations at the regional and sub-regional levels which actually are charged with mandates for resolving conflicts and for establishing and re-establishing peace. In Asia, the UN will find it hard to locate such partners because there are organizations, there are regional organizations, a lot of them, but they do not have on their remit issues of to address issues of peace and security. And that is a point, I think, which member states need to take home and see how these regional organizations can be encouraged to become more active and more effective and more useful to the world at large and their regions in particular in the areas of peace and conflict. So, and then UN will be able to find partners in Asia also in order to address situations of conflict. Thank you. I think I'll end there.
Thank you very much. Moving on, still on focusing on implementation, Saraswati. As you know, the report gives a great deal of importance on coherence and on smooth transition of UN presences in the field. Can you explain what that means? What some of the recommendations of the report means for these transitions in the field?
We feel very strongly that peace is made and sustained on the ground. And therefore, what the United Nations does on the ground in support of peace is critical. And when we talk about coherence, I think essentially we are talking throughout the report of coherence across the three dimensions of the United Nations work: peace and security, human rights, and development. When we look at a pre-conflict or during a conflict or post-conflict situation, we see that the United Nations is configured in very many different ways. The UN country team is on the ground before a conflict, during a conflict, and after a conflict. During the conflict, they are often embedded within a peacekeeping mission or a special political mission, and there are varying levels of integration and so on. So perhaps one of our key recommendations is that the importance of, whatever the configuration, the importance of high-quality leadership and capacity on the ground is critical. And here we are looking not just at leadership and capacity, but also accountability of the heads of missions. Because the configurations are very different, but in terms of actual results, we don't see sufficient attention being paid not only to building leadership and building capacity, but also in terms of what actually happens on the ground. Linked to this, in our experience looking at countries, we have seen some models at work, and so we really would encourage the UN system to do more along these lines. One was the model of an executive representative of the Secretary General. We just heard reference to it in Burundi, where again the development and peace and security elements are brought much more closely together under one leadership, not just shared leadership, but actually one leadership. And so we encourage more use of this. You asked about ensuring smooth transitions, and Gert referred to the critical issue of funding. There are two other elements in terms of transition. One is what happens at the end of a mission when the sort of handover takes place to a country team. The country team or the resident coordinator is left with minimal political capacity, minimal peace-building capacity, and has to reinvent this on the ground as needed. So we see some need for continuity in that, so that the capacity itself stays there. And secondly, suddenly I shouldn't say umbilical cord, but the cord to New York, the cord to political issues is cut. And the country team is sort of left on its own. So we feel there must be a much closer link to headquarters through this period post-conflict. But the same in a way is true of a pre-conflict situation, where we feel country teams must have the capacity to step up to prevent conflict itself. There is an area of reform that is already taking place with trying to strengthen the resident coordinator with formal authority over the UN country team, which now does not exist in situations, in a post-conflict situation, and that's something we would encourage. But we have also made another recommendation, which I believe is also in the Peace Operations report, which is we call for an independent review of the current capacities and potential for enhancement of United Nations agencies, funds, and programs so that they can contribute to sustaining peace before, during, and after conflict. No careful review has been done of this full set of issues, and we think that is very important. Finally, a lot can be done through reform and by the UN system itself. But legislative framing is extremely important, and there are two areas that we highlight in the report. The first is the quarterly comprehensive policy review of operational activities actually should pay some attention to peace building and give some guidance to the UN system. And the second is, we have seen that with the sort of identification of least developed countries, of LDCs, there's much greater attention from the international community in terms of funding, in terms of support. Now, if we are arguing that countries who are affected by conflict, who are engaged in peace building, need special attention, then perhaps we have suggested that ECOSOC or others could actually define criteria which would encourage not only greater attention from the UN system, but also from other partners in the international community. Thank you.
Thank you very much. We are coming to the end of the first round, and I'd like to address this question to Oscar. In the course of preparing these two reports of which I am, these processes or these reviews of which I am a member of, some people pointed out that the various recommendations of these three global policy reviews provide a golden opportunity for the Peacebuilding Commission to further leverage its advisory and catalytic function by bringing together the strands of these various reports. Since three of them, the main objective is sustaining peace. Do you see the Peacebuilding Commission playing this leveraging role by bringing together the synergies between these three various global policy reviews and their recommendations? 3 to 5 minutes.
I'll be shorter. I do hope. I think the work is cut out now for member states to start translating what I think is a very honest, a very frank assertion as to what is not working, and what is not working, and what is just as much as we can almost guarantee that there's always scarce funding for addressing the type of immediate post-conflict needs, we can almost guarantee that unless this fragmentation and coherence and a more, if you will, proactive approach is not undertaken, peacekeeping operations will continue to expand way beyond the current $8 to $9 billion, and certainly humanitarian operations will continue to expand way beyond the $18 to $24 billion that we're talking about. So I think it's a question now of ascertaining how, in the life cycle of conflicts, this organization that was meant precisely to prevent the scourge of war is able to anticipate and act proactively in a manner that addresses the emerging challenges. And this is what the Peacebuilding Commission was established to do. I think in the morning session, Ambassador Rosenthal was talking about the systemic problem. This is a problem that cuts across the way that member states engage with the UN in a very fragmented and through the existing silos. We have different bodies dealing with human rights. We have different bodies dealing with development. We have a different mechanism with peace and security, even on humanitarian responses. And that is a member state architecture issue that needs now to be addressed so that the bridging function that Ambassador Rosenthal was referring to is actually acknowledged and used. Because if there is the perception that there is this encroachment factor, which I think the report very much points to, the concerns in the General Assembly about the role of the Security Council, or the concerns of the Security Council about the roles of the other principal organs. I think on the issue of sustaining peace, there must be agreement that certainly to prevent the type of economic and human costs that were consistently being asked to come to repair needs to be addressed proactively ahead of these conflicts. And so I think one very important think, approach, which requires maybe a different mindset altogether in member states, among member states, within the UN, is that peace building is everybody's job here. It's not just the Peacebuilding Commission. And I think this comes out very, very clear. That is also not just uniquely the job of the UN, although the UN has a critical role to play in terms of its convening power and how we do the diplomatic political effort and the immediate response. But to the issue of partnerships, I think there's a need to bring in more ownership within the functioning of the Peacebuilding Commission, more representation, more diversity. And much as Anis was saying, that peace building cannot be confined to the predicament of certain countries in certain continents. This is something that we see. It's interesting that the Peace Building Fund intervenes in some 25 to 29 countries, and not just the 5 or 6, which the Peace Building Commission is focusing on. So I think this is a very important discussion going forward that I hope in the coming months we're able to engage proactively and seriously. I think it's very much linked, as I think the report says. There have been many attempts to reforms, but because this is a very political undertaking, how we bring the House together, how we bring member states and the House together to address before, during, and after situations, I think speaks to the huge opportunity that this organization, the potential, that is not just the PBCs, I think it's the whole UN's potential needs to be unleashed with this clearer understanding about how we responsibly move forward in a predictable manner, not on a case-by-case reinventing the wheel every time we have either a new mission or a new crisis to address. So a lot of hope for a revigorized and redefined Peacebuilding Commission.
Thank you very much, Oscar. This is being a report launch event. We, by design, gave more time to the panelists than we normally do, but we still have time for questions and answer. We have good 25 minutes. So if you could raise your hand and I will acknowledge you, and then the microphone will come your way. So I have this lady to my right, and then you, and then you.
Good afternoon. Thank you so much for your presentations. My name is Yvonne Duarte Peña, and I work at the UN Secretariat. Something that is rather striking when one reads the report is that 3 out of the 5 cases that you look into are either facing conflict relapse or really the prospect of conflict renewal, Central African Republic, South Sudan, and Burundi. Although you examine in the report some of the driving issues that led to the sort of failure for sustaining peace, my question is if you could perhaps go back in time and see in a much more positive way what should exactly and more specifically the Peacebuilding Commission, the Peacebuilding Architecture should have done to make a difference, to avoid in each of the 3 countries what we are seeing today.
Thank you. To your neighbor to your right.
Thank you. My name is Yvonne from the Indonesian mission. I just fully agree with the report's view that there's a systemic problem within the UN that critically needs to be solved. In fact, in recommending the establishment of the Peacebuilding Architecture in 2005, Kofi Annan has stated that there's a gaping hole in the UN institutional machinery, the gaping hole on collective and coherent action to address the challenge of sustaining peace. And your report recommends that there should be partnership mode in the area of sustaining peace. But then when the report views that the term quote-unquote architecture doesn't really fit with the overall work of the advisory experts, I'm just wondering, how do you see this in relation to the TOR, the terms of reference of the 2015 Peacebuilding Architecture, that which clearly stated it comprises of the Peacebuilding Commission, PBSO, and PBF. So, and how do you see the next intergovernmental process that will discuss this report will view on this issue? Because I think many might find that this issue is actually not on the term of architecture itself, which was already there since 2005, but how the partnership between PBC, PBF, and PBSO, and with the 3 main organs, in particular the Security Council, and vice versa, and how the three main organs can optimally optimize the role of the PBC. And Ambassador Rosenthal, I fully agree with you that the PBC needs to be the bridge for these three main organs. But I think it is also fair to say after the bridge is built, then it's fair to say that the three main organs need to effectively use the bridge. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Then the microphone to me.
Thank you, Jeff Laurenti. Been a fascinating presentation at a higher level of abstraction, so allow me to press the question into something a little more concrete. Besides the Peacebuilding Fund, if you, Oscar, could give us some sense about the Peacebuilding Support Office's actual net contribution, because in some of the sessions we have had here over the past several weeks, SRSGs have discreetly hinted at the question of whether the peace-building architecture adds value or essentially duplicates what guys in the field, the SRSGs themselves and others, are trying to feed into the Security Council. Does the Peacebuilding Support Office have expertise within its own ranks that make for a value added rather than a repetition of what DPA or other folks may have? And then particularly to Ambassador Rosenthal, the question of the configuration chairs and what they bring separate from what the SRSG brings in terms of focusing attention here in New York. One can talk about, gee, it's great to have the ECOSOC and GA represented, but when you have recalcitrant factions in countries that are not really fully out of the woods and recovering from conflict, that are threatening to dig in their heels or break with an accord, they're not as scared of ECOSOC and they're not scared of the GA. It's holding the attention of the Security Council, and how do we see that being different going forward than what it has been episodic till now?
Thank you. And the one last question, and then I'll throw it back to the panels.
Thank you, Bill Pace with WFM Institute for Global Policy. And it has been a very interesting meeting, and I haven't read the report, but I've looked at it on my iPhone, et cetera, and I would look forward to full reading. But unfortunately, that won't prevent me from commenting on it. You talk about the fragmentation of the organs, but I really think the fragmentation within the organs, but in particular within the Security Council, is an issue that really warrants some discussion. Here you have 3 to 5 architects, one's building a window and the other one's building a wall in the same place, and over and over and over and over again. And so at some point you would think that a peace-building architecture review would ask us to, when are we going to review the architecture of the Security Council in how it's operating relative to peace building, human rights, et cetera. Of course, that I think would include other architectural dimensions, but I just feel that the Security Council is getting too much of a pass on some of this when, and Mr. Taranko, I wished I could believe that the Security Council cared about prevention, but I don't know any examples of where in 60-some years there's been a prevention action. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Very simple questions. So I will turn the easiest among them to our panelists to my right about the sustainability of the bridge, and more importantly, in the report, and even though you have not read the report, indeed, the report does encourage the Security Council to take more proactive role in prevention. How could this organ perform this function of prevention if it is fragmented within? Maybe you could take a stab at that, and then maybe my good friend You could address the issue of conflict relapse, Saraswati, in three of the countries that she's mentioned. And then I leave Oscar the question addressed to him, and perhaps you could take few minutes to comment on all of them. And let's see if you could say 2 to 3 minutes each, please. Go ahead, Ambassador Gert.
Well, I'll start with the last observation on Security Council reform. When the group of 7 people met the first time, the first week of February, everybody agreed we should be bold, but we should also be pragmatic. In the sense that, we should come out with bold proposals that have a probability of finding some resonance. So I think mixing the topic of peace building with the topic of Security Council reform maybe goes beyond the possibility of pragmatism. But we do mention somewhere I think in the first chapter, that the permanent tension between the Security Council and the General Assembly, of which Security Council reform forms part, has to be taken as a background for this discussion. The thing is, the more you move in that direction, I'll exaggerate just to make the point. If we come to the broader membership and say, you know what, to make the UN better in peace building, you have to reform the Security Council. That's not going to fly. So why try it? What will fly, I think, because it doesn't require a change either in legislation or not even in the rules of procedure, is for you guys to work together, at least in certain countries. I know it's a tall order, and as we speak, we're having a discussion on Haiti, on the possibility of moving Haiti to the agenda of the Peacebuilding Commission. And we're encountering resistance on the part of some members of the Security Council. So this is a real issue, and it's an important issue. And I don't have a solution to it except to say that it's perfectly feasible for the Security Council to work together with the other 3 organs. Which brings me to the gaping hole. I think I don't know what Kofi Annan was thinking when he spoke of a gaping hole, but I would like to think that he wasn't thinking of creating a peace-building commission to fill the gaping hole. I think he was thinking of creating the institutional framework so that the principal organs can fill that gaping hole. Because this is an issue that the whole UN has to deal with, peace building. And there was nobody to bring the different parts together. So we created this thing which presumably would bring the different parts together, and it hasn't happened. So we have to ask ourselves, why didn't it happen? And part of it is a bureaucratic culture of each organization. We can change bureaucratic cultures. I'm not sure we can change the composition of the Security Council, at least not in the next year or 2. But we can change behavior, patterns of behavior. So that's what my reaction would be. And Jeff asked me one thing. Remind me.
About the relative abilities of the... Yes, it was about configuration chairs and their relative value added vis-a-vis SRSGs in focusing resources and Security Council attention.
That's a really important issue. And I'm going to be very honest, because a lot of the presidents of confederations are very good friends of mine, and many have done a great job. But the thing is that there are some things you can do from New York, and there are some things you can't do from New York. What you can do from New York is advocacy, and maybe helping getting resources, maybe giving advice. But what you can't do from New York is get involved in what's going on the ground. There's no way. And the problem is that when we created the country configurations, it has elements of getting involved, of work on the ground. And at that moment, the president of the configuration starts treading the toes of either the SRSG or whoever represents the UN. There is a problem there. And that's why we would like to go back to a more sensible figure for the country configuration, which doesn't mean that they haven't had value added, and where they've had value added, it usually had to do a lot with the personality of the particular person in charge. You know, you can comment a lot on it, but the bottom line is, I think all of us agree, the 7 of us agree, that the locus of the peace building should go back to the Peacebuilding Commission, not the country configurations. Country configurations are subsidiary bodies of the Peacebuilding Commission, which can be usefully deployed sometimes, not always. You don't even need them in some cases. And that's what we learned from the last experience.
Thank you very much. Something to reflect on that we've experimented when I was in Burundi was for the chair of the country-specific configuration and the SRSG to hold the main meeting in Bujumbura with New York connected through satellite connection. In other words, switched the issue. You want to address the question about what the Peacebuilding Commission could have done to prevent the relapse or renewal of conflict in certainly CAR or Burundi?
I wish we could answer that question. There was a point when we were doing our case studies that we were getting a little worried because everywhere we went, a week or so after we left, there was a problem. And so, I don't want to talk about cause and effect, and it's difficult to do. But one caution I want to say is we did these case studies not in the spirit of doing intensive case studies which would answer all the questions about peace building in that country, but really to exemplify or to help us develop thoughts about the entire scope of our work. So, in a short period, you cannot do an intensive look. And I also just want another caution. Our emphasis was not so much what could the peacebuilding architecture or the peacebuilding commission do differently, but we were looking for the contributions that they made in each situation. Now, you cited that we've had problems in 3, and maybe the way we approached it in the report is really to tease out issues that are important. And let me just give you 3, which address not just by the peacebuilding architecture, but by the entire international community and nationally make a difference. The first is the importance of national leadership. And we looked at the experience of Timor-Leste, where this was key. In fact, there were cases, especially with the setting up of the truth and friendship, the whole reconciliation process, where they went against the advice of the international community, but with good effect, with good results. So, the role of national leadership is key. And so that's something, if you look at what needs to be done differently, is also the way we work with national leaders. The second is building institutions. And you cited Burundi. And in the case of Burundi, I think we say, and I hope we are borne out in the future also, that the creation of institutions, or the support, not creation, but the capacity development of institutions seems to have succeeded because it has not collapsed really into a full-scale, conflict. And that seems to have made a difference. And I hope that will hold. But that's, again, a very important strand. And the third issue that we do elaborate on, not in the case of particular countries, but in general, but probably it applies to some extent to South Sudan and to Central African Republic, is that in the current situation, in the way many of these societies are formed and developed, the imposition and the attention only to the establishment of central state apparatus doesn't work. And peace has to be built bottom up, must take into account local considerations, and perhaps not enough of that is being done. Inclusive peace, and also an understanding of the kind of issues that people face in the way they are socially organized in communities, in ethnic groups, and other groups, and that often the attention of the international community is just reach a settlement at the center and establish central authority. And that can unravel very quickly. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Oscar, the PBSO, its comparative advantages with other secretariat entities dealing with peace and security. And
Stefan, it is one of those evolving issues. It's a trick question of sorts, I guess. But let me put it this way. I think the report makes a very compelling case that if we're going to have a more substantive, a more engaged, a more relevant peacebuilding commission, then the secretariat that supports its work needs to be strengthened by association. And I think that certainly the Peacebuilding Support Office is the smallest of all the entities that you can possibly imagine. The real peace builders are the big departments, DPA, DPKO, the agencies on the ground, etc. But I think the value added of the Peacebuilding Support Office located in the Secretariat is precisely to be able to be the bridge between member states and the UN system in its integrated manner. And because the Peacebuilding Office both manages a fund and supports a secretariat function, the issue here is how we can leverage good policy developments, as was the case, for example, with all the work that happened last year with the Peacebuilding Commission on the issue of illicit transfer of funds, national revenue generation, or the whole focus that the Peacebuilding Commission gave to the Ebola response to focus on the peace building, ensuring that the peace building gains were not eroded as a result of a response that doesn't factor in the political, economic, and other tensions that were resulting. So linking the member state dynamic with the UN dynamic, I think, is extremely important. Certainly, we are absolutely understaffed. There's no question. We only get 14 regular budgeted posts. Half of the office is actually financed through voluntary contributions. So I think it goes to a very serious part of what type of UN do we want. If we want a UN that is predictable in terms of bringing together the UN system, then certainly the Peacebuilding Support Office sees as its top priority to support the leadership on the ground. And that certainly is the case today when we immediately respond to either a request from General Guy to help in rapid demobilization of ex-Seleka or anti-Balaka militia members, whether it's how we are currently supporting the dialogue and negotiations effort in Burundi to precisely disarm militias associated to political parties. This is the value added of the PBSO, is to build on political analysis of certain departments, but the operational strength of delivering programmatic response. So that role, I think, does need to be strengthened if we want, and if the PBSO is going to grow in size and in function. Because one of the strong recommendations here is that the mandates that are discussed in the Security Council should be informed by best peace-building practices, right? I don't think the Council has the time to compare what has worked and what doesn't. This should be the job precisely of the Peacebuilding Commission, and to look at the medium and longer-term issues of transition. So a strengthened PBSO should not be seen as a threat. If anything, it should be seen as a complementary function to what already exists in the UN. And particularly, I think the two reviews make an interesting suggestion about strategic planning functions in the UN as such. And I think this is, I guess, going forward, a lot of the discussions among member states will be precisely how do we translate the need for, as the report says, the PBSO should be strengthened to become a center of excellence in the areas of analysis, policy prescription, program advice, as well as tracking developments in the field. So this we need to do, and I think this runs very strong in the report, in partnership with the rest of the UN, not as a standalone function. And I think the performance and the results obtained through the Peacebuilding Fund demonstrates how an entity within the Secretariat is able to ensure that DPA is talking to UNDP, is talking to OHCHR, is talking to UN Women, and that we are promoting gender equality initiatives of the sort that translate policy into practice. So I think that is the integrating role of the office. Thanks.
Thank you. Anis, any final comments before we close?
Well, thank you for asking me for final comments. I thought you were going to do that for me, and but I just want to say one or two things, just as a bit of further clarification on what has been amply answered by my very wise colleagues. On the gaping hole that was mentioned by Secretary General Kofi Annan, we in our consideration thought that it was not described fully when the gaping hole was described by the Secretary General then, because he mentioned the gaping hole in terms of UN's capability or capacity to support states coming out of conflict. Therefore, it related only to a post-conflict environment, whereas we are not seeing peace building as a post-conflict activity. Our report very clearly suggests that we need to look at peace building or sustaining peace as an activity that runs through the complete cycle of peace and conflict. So that's one major difference. The other thing is, again, our TORs and whether we are addressing how to tweak the architecture according to the TORs or not, is that it is not only about the three entities that we would say term as peace-building architecture, because in our understanding, that the AGE's understanding, the responsibility for establishing peace, for consolidating peace, for sustaining peace is a shared responsibility of all organs and all entities of the UN system. And therefore, it is not just these three components, which were created in 2005, that we should look at, because we think it was important to look at the whole practice of peace building and not just these three entities, because only then we can suggest what must be done for the future. Because our report, we thought, must address the future and not the past. It is a report for the member states and the United Nations to do things that would help prevent conflict and will help resolve conflict. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I was certain he would deal with the final words I was supposed to be saying adequately. So please join me in thanking our panelists for a good evening.